Hello, everybody. It's me, Emmett, your nuclear barbarian, here with another episode of the Nuclear Barbarians podcast. Today is an exciting day because I have one of my favorite people on the podcast. I have Meredith Angwin, author, thoughtful energy, writer, talk giver, etc. Hello, Meredith. Welcome.
Oh, hello, Emmett. Very glad to be here. Always like to see you.
Yeah, likewise. So we have a lot to get into today about the grid and your writing on the grid, and especially because we are walking headlong into an energy crisis about what we might expect out of this winter or problems that we see happening right now. But first, I'd like for the audience to get to know you a little bit. What's your background? How did you get to the point where you wrote a whole book on problems in the US electrical grid?
Well, I started out, I wanted to be a scientist and I wanted to be a chemist. And in chemistry, I became interested in mineral chemistry and I was pursuing my PhD in that. I have a master's. I didn't complete the PhD. But at any rate, that led me to being interested in geothermal energy and to working with utility research on how to get geothermal energy to work better. And we did a lot of corrosion control issues and pollution control issues, which somehow segued into me doing pollution control and corrosion control issues, especially pollution control with gas turbines, which segued to me getting a job at the Electric Power Research Institute as one of the first women project managers back in geothermal. And then after that, moving over to nuclear. So by that time, I'd been in almost every possible part of the utility industry. And I became very in favor of nuclear also. When I sort of semi-retired from California to Vermont because our kids live in the East Coast, I began doing other things, including doing an energy blog. And I was in favor of the local nuclear plant, Vermont Yankee. I still am. Unfortunately, it's closed. But when I was doing my energy blog, a man who read it said to me, I noticed that you cover grid issues once in a while, which was really true, once in a while. And he said, why don't you join the consumer liaison group of the grid operator and even run for the coordinating committee of that group? I said, really? I didn't even know our grid operator had a consumer liaison group.
Right.
It's not exactly advertised. There's not announcements in the paper, consumer liaison group meeting tomorrow. I mean, it was just kind of like this thing that if someone who knew about it would tell you about it. And anyway, so the long and short of it is I did join the consumer liaison group and its coordinating committee and got elected to be on its coordinating committee. And then I really began learning about the grid. And I was really kind of shocked because it was just how a regional transmission organization, an RTOh, makes decisions is so odd and so convoluted. And I would try and tell my friends about it. Well, that didn't work because I would have to spend half an hour explaining something before I could begin telling them. So the net result is I decided the things that I was seeing were things that were making the grid more fragile, making it more likely that the grid would have rolling blackouts and I wanted to write about this in a way that people could learn about it without having to sit there for 20 minutes while I got to the point, in other words, because, let's say I said to you, capacity markets don't help. You might say, really? What's a capacity market? And, it's just too much. It's all too much. I mean, if you read about what happened in Texas, there'll be somebody saying, well, the thing is they have an energy only market. If they had a capacity market, if I want to rebut that, it'll take me 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I guess that's how I got into writing this book, because I wanted to write about it, but I realized that unlike other things that can be done sort of short form. That is, write a blog post, write a magazine article.
Mm-hmm.
Writing about the grid has so many layers of band-aids about the policy. The policy is just a conglomeration of this on top of that, on top of this, on top of that. Oh, that went too far this way, so we'll add something that'll bring it back the other way. Oh, whoops, gosh, let's try this again. And you can't tell a coherent story about it. I mean, it's really impossible to tell a coherent story about it. I did my best to do so in the book Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid. And what I wanted to show in that is that nobody is responsible in a RTOh area, a so-called deregulated area, for reliability. There's just no responsibility for reliability. The buck of reliability doesn't stop on anyone's desk. Nobody will be fined for lack of reliability. And basically, what do we have? Poor reliability. It's getting worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that story starts with somebody commenting on your blog, like, hey, why don't you show up to this thing? And it created a whole new vista from which to view huge problems with fundamental infrastructure.
I invited a friend of mine from Vermont to come to the one of the meetings with me. And he said something really clever. He said, at the end of the meeting, he said to me, Meredith, I feel like a hobbit who just discovered there's a world beyond the Shire.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that you talk about in the book is that there's really two grids, right? There's sort of the grid at the infrastructural level, which generates, transmits, and distributes electricity. And then there is the legal market framework of the grid on top of it, and they have some correspondence. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I call it the physical grid and the policy grid.
Yeah, exactly.
And the problems, now the policy grid also includes how generators get paid. I mean, payment is an important part of policy. And so the policy grid is where most of the problems come in. And to me, that was a little bit difficult because as a physical chemist, while I'm not an electrical engineer, I am very attuned to physical problems, to physical issues, corrosion, transmission loss, whatever.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I found myself reading FERC orders and jump balls, which is when you present two things to FERC at the same time and they're supposed to choose. And, it's like, oh, this is a different world.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could tell us, what's different about this RTOh ISO structure compared to how we used to do things in large parts of the country?
Very simply, I would say simply that in the old days, there was a sort of a planning system, and the utility was vertically integrated, which meant that it owned generating units or parts of generating units if there was a big one and a small utility. And it was responsible for soup to nuts. It was responsible for the generating unit not going down too much, and for transmission and distribution not going down too much, and for billing you. And then if you were impoverished, it would be responsible for some kind of low cost arrangement or whatever. And so in other words, from the generator to the issues of the homeowner, you knew who was in charge. And so did it get to do anything it wanted? No, it was overseen. Often it was overseen quite well by the State Public Utility Commission and FERC. FERC being the national organization that had certain rules that all the states had to follow. But people thought, well, this is not good, because the way the Public Utility Commission and the vertically integrated utilities work is that the utility builds things and the Public Utilities Commission makes sure that it doesn't go bankrupt. In other words, it gets paid for what it builds and so forth, and it gets a rate of return on its capital investments. So the rate of return is fixed by the Public Utilities Commission. And the rate of return will be dependent on the power being reliable. If the utility ends up with a lot of outages, then the utility commission will fine it, and it will not have a good rate of return. So the utility has a strong incentive to build things in a way that's very reliable, and therefore the power will keep being gone. And to some extent, it has an incentive to overbuild and to gold plate, okay? But all of these are in service, ultimately, not just of a higher rate of return, but of reliability. There's an incentive to reliability, which supposedly could lead to higher costs for the ratepayer. Now, it turns out that we've moved away from that. People said, oh, we've got to get the noble hand of the market, or the invisible noble hand of the market in here, and that'll lower the costs. And it didn't. I have in the book, I have 4 examples of people who did analysis of costs, in academic analysis of costs in vertically integrated versus RTOh areas. And the RTOh areas were always higher. And of course, 3 of the 4 basically said, well, they're higher because they're RTOh areas. And one of the 4 said, well, we don't really know. They seem to be higher and they're RTOh areas, but we can't really put it that way. Maybe the non-RTOh areas have more inexpensive coal, so we're not gonna even go there. But nobody says that the RTOh saved money. The only people who say that are people who are participating in the markets and who can say, oh, the cost in the auctions has gone down. That's saving money. No, it isn't. It isn't, because the person who gets the bill at home, they're paying the whole system cost, not the cost in the auction. And I could go on for a while, but basically there are many things in the system costs. Let me give you an example of many things in the system costs. Okay, just one example. Let's say you have a area with a lot of wind turbines, and the wind turbines bid into the auctions at 0 cents or minus 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And since there are a lot of them, they kind of drive down the prices in the auctions. The highest price isn't as high as it would be if the wind turbines weren't there. And someone says, look, the wind turbines are saving money for the consumer. But they don't show to you a couple of other things. The first is the wind turbines need 100% backup. In other words, if in a regular grid, you say any power plant can go down, but no power plant is designed to be more than 10% of the grid. So if we have a grid with 20% more power plants on it than is required at the top, then we have a good reserve margin here, 20%. But if you have wind turbines, you've got to have 100% backup for them, because they can go down, and then you have to have something that comes up. It's not a matter of, it can happen that at the peak, we could end up losing a power plant that's 10% of our grid, so we better have 20% more power plants on the grid than we would have otherwise had. No, if you've got 40% wind turbines on the grid, you have to have 40% power plants that'll kick in when the wind turbines aren't available. And the other thing is their common mode failure, right? Usually if there's a wind dearth, if there's a static weather system, it's not just for one wind turbine.
Right, exactly. Well, the UK has experienced that all year, and now they're running into troubles this winter. That's part of what's happening over there. But I also wanted to ask about, there are so many issues, like just even with that there are there's no real consideration of like outside cost or externalities or anything that happens here. But one of the things that people bring up is they say, well, that's just why we need batteries. Like we
Oh,
just
yeah.
need batteries. We could back it up with batteries. So I was wondering if you tell us like, what's your take on the battery response to that?
Well, well, I don't think it's going to happen. And the reason is that batteries are basically too small and too expensive. And maybe that'll change. Someone will say, oh, it's going to change. I don't think it is. As a chemist, I think we're doing pretty well on optimizing batteries, but I certainly can't say we'll never make a breakthrough. We could, but that's the word, could.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, everybody wants to tell you about the could grid,
Mm-hmm.
the word that could happen if we had enough batteries and they were inexpensive enough. But we don't have enough batteries, and they're unlikely to have enough because they're not inexpensive enough.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest battery system that I know about is 150 megawatts, and it can put out approximately 200 megawatt hours. Now, my little local nuclear plant was closed down because, well, there were many people who were against it,
Mm-hmm.
but the official reason it was closed down, it was too small to be cost effective. It was 620 megawatts, and it could run for 18 months without a stop.
Wow.
So compare that. And as a matter of fact, it did several times. And those of us who loved it were always sending them a little note saying, congratulations on your breaker to breaker run, and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But most people were completely oblivious to Vermont Yankee just had a breaker to breaker run where it didn't have to go offline for 18 months. I mean, they were oblivious totally. But at any rate, what I'm trying to say is if you look at 150 megawatts that can provide 200 megawatt hours, and you're saying, this is our biggest battery, it's going to really be a help in backing up the grid. And meanwhile, on the actual grid, and New England is not a particularly big grid. It's not tiny. It's
Right.
not,
It's
but it's
mid-sized.
not a particularly big grid, and on our grid, 700 megawatt hours was like, I'm sorry, 620 megawatts for 18 months wasn't enough to be cost effective. So what do you think 200 megawatt hours is going to be?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the other issue that it seems to me is that the idea that storage is the same thing as generation.
Yeah, people don't don't get that. I think the thing is that most of us have throwaway batteries. I mean, let's face it.
My friend Adrian refers to it as Rube Goldberging the grid,
Yes.
where it's like, oh, okay, the wind's gone, so we need to bring on all these batteries, but then the solar's gone, so now we have to bring on even more gas. And it's like you never know what to expect because each thing has this hidden impact on another part of the grid, even
Right.
down to more traditional generators wearing out their component parts, trying to keep up with the unreliability of renewables built out onto the grid. And one of the things that you bring up is how the auction house in an RTO is structured so that it advantages renewables and natural gas,
Yes, it
right?
does.
And I was wondering if you could explain that for us just a little bit.
Okay. First of all, on our grid, there's two auctions, two
Mm-hmm.
major auctions. One of them is an auction that takes place every 5 minutes and you're selling kilowatt hours. And the other is an auction that takes place every 3 years and you're selling kilowatts or megawatts installed. So the megawatts installed one is the capacity auction. And the kilowatt hour one is the kilowatt hour. When we turn on a light, what we're getting is kilowatt hours, not capacity. But what happened was that people noticed, or even perhaps designed to understand before noticing, that if you just had a kilowatt hour auction, which is what Texas has,
Mm.
then you would find yourself with plants that were only used part of the time, not making enough money to keep themselves up. The owners would say, yeah, I have this plant, but I don't know how many hours it's going to run, what I'll be paid for those hours, and exactly how much do you expect me to invest in maintenance under these circumstances. I think I'll take my plant and go home. And so the purpose of the capacity auction was to keep those plants on the grid. But the capacity auction also has the effect of advantaging those plants. And so, for example, let's say you have a gas plant and it's going to bid in a kilowatt hour only auction. It'll have to bid in enough money to keep itself on the grid. But if it's got capacity payments, it will get it'll often get more than half of its money through those capacity payments. So it can bid in comparatively low to the grid.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look around at how this all works out, I have a section in the book called Selling Kilowatt Hours is a Losing Game. Mm-hmm. If you're selling kilowatt hours, if you're trying to make a living as a power plant by selling kilowatt hours, which is after all what people use,
right,
you're going to lose money because the prices on the grid will be driven down by the combination of renewable plants that actually don't need a penny from the grid to keep going because they have so many subsidies. Mm-hmm. So they can bid in at zero or even at, I'll pay you 2 cents to take my power. And gas plants that they bid in, but they're only bidding in the extra money they need on top of their 50% of their expenses paid by the capacity market.
Right.
So if you're trying to compete with subsidies and plants that are getting most of their money from the capacity market by selling kilowatt hours, you're on the way to lose. You mm-hmm. will lose. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons that the plants that run most of the time go off the grid. So they retire. Mm-hmm. They just retire.
Yeah, they can't make money.
They can't make money, so they close. And as I said at the beginning of my book, I tried to explain why I named it Shorting the Grid. Well, of course, part of the name mm-hmm. is kind of a pun on short circuiting. I mean, I get that part. That's what I thought it would be memorable and so forth. But the other part is that I was trying to echo The Big Short. Because in The Big Short, which is a book I've reread several times and watched the movie several times, because it struck me as such a model for so many different types of things that go wrong. Okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, just an amazing model. And in The Big Short, the value of the mortgage, it was about the mortgage market and the liar loan mortgages and all mm-hmm. the other non-conforming mortgages that were out there and how they were built up in tiers of units. And even though every mortgage in the unit probably wouldn't be paid back, the whole unit was rated AAA. I mean, all this stuff. But what it turned out is that the low quality mortgages were very valuable. And the high quality mortgages were valuable too, but not particularly more valuable, probably less valuable. And similarly on the grid, the low quality power plants, and I'm sorry if people are going to be offended at this, but in my opinion, a power plant that goes on and off when it wants to and doesn't notice whether there's requirements for power on the grid, that is an intermittent power plant, is low quality. It mm-hmm. doesn't help the grid very much. It has to be backed up by a plant that you can control. So the low quality power plants are the ones that are guaranteed to make money. Mm-hmm. It's upside down. Reliability is not a way to make money.
And I think also part of it's the volatility seems to be good for the secondary markets, because if it's just going to be steady state and show up all the time, then there's really nothing to have a secondary market on in the way that they're structured now. I also think that part of what's happening is I liked your idea that the Big Short is sort of this model, because I've been thinking something similarly about like ESG, is that it has like these sort of elements of, it gives me like notes of the subprime mortgage crisis, because people are like, oh, well, they're going to be crappy investments or who knows how they work, but like that's fine. But they forget that ESG also means like disinvestment from stable power sources, even if you don't like those power sources, like gas or coal or something like that. And that 60 hertz is 60 hertz. You know, the grid needs what it needs to stay alive. Like rationing a grid is just rolling blackouts. It's not like that's how you ration a grid, is you just have blackouts and brownouts. And there's no like long-term concern for that. But also, and I know we've talked about this before, there's just like structural irresponsibility here, right? Because it's who's on the hook for this, right? Because it seems to me the argument goes, or the way that it's built goes, that you can't have reliable backup on site because that would be unfair in the structure of the auction house or something like that. I remember that you called it in the book like the name that fuel problem or something.
Yes, well, you can't. What happened was that our grid operator, ISO New England, I think very, very highly of the people who work there. Mm-hmm. Whether the RTOh system is a mess, but they're in their pitching to make it at least reasonable. Mm-hmm. They look forward at the amount of natural gas fired plants that are on the grid and the number of plants with fuel on site, such as coal plants and nuclear plants that were closing down. And they said, we aren't going to have the kind of resource adequacy we need in a cold snap, because in the cold snap, those natural gas plants won't be able to get natural gas because the houses have priority to get natural gas. So houses have priority. If it's 20 below at night, the houses will be using a lot more natural gas than it's 20 above at night. That's just the way it goes. And therefore, while the power plant could get enough natural gas through the pipeline when it's 20 above, at 20 below, it won't. So the power plant will go offline. So they said, well, we know how to fix this. Many of the natural gas power plants are dual fired. That is, they can burn natural gas, or they have other nozzles and they can shoot oil in, or generally distillate oil. I mean, not bunker C or anything. Right. But anyway, they can, all you need to do is store some oil there and they can go. And so the grid operator came up with what they called the winter reliability program. The natural gas power plants that were dual fired had to bid in, they always were bidding in, how inexpensive a set of oil they could hope to obtain. And if their bid was chosen, then ISO New England would guarantee them that amount of money. And if they didn't use the oil, they got the money anyway. And if they did use the oil, then they probably wouldn't need the money because they'd be paid so much by the grid for the electricity. So anyway, it was all set up that way. And it wasn't just that oil could bid in. I have to tell you that demand response could always bid into that. The thing is, demand response means I'll go offline if you want me to. And the number of companies that really want to go offline for a small amount of money when it's 20 below is not big. So, so really they got very few demand response bids. I don't remember what it was in the book, but I think they ended up spending like 20 million on oil and 40,000 on demand response. I mean, it was incredibly disparate numbers. But it wasn't just oil. But the thing is, oil is what was the useful thing, and that's what been in. So anyway, FERC looked at this situation and said, well, we're giving you 3 years for this. We understand that you see there's a crisis. You need to have this because otherwise your grid will go down. We get it. But you've got 3 years to get over this buying oil stuff and set up a market mechanism which is fair to all the different kinds of power plants. Because what you're doing now is you're giving advantages to oil, and we don't like that. We don't allow that. Right. You're an RTOh. You can't give an advantage to oil.
Mm-hmm.
And so they shut down that system. That even though that our grid during the 2018-2019 holiday cold snap was running 30% on oil. This was not a trivial thing. This was not a marginal amount of oil being used at some obscure power plant. This is the grid running 30% on oil. Mm-hmm. And the oil that was used was through the ISO New England Winter Reliability Program. FERC just shut it down. And what do you think this means in terms of FERC's prioritization of reliability?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's basically, it's not a priority.
It's not a priority.
It's off the table. They have other priorities instead. It's not even that reliability seems to be like subservient to others. It's that it isn't the motivating.
No, it's not motivating.
Yeah, for them. I mean, that seems to be like the difference between the things I see. I mean, right now it seems like there is actually some sort of fight happening between FERC heads about what to do with RTOs and whether we should have more or not, and whether they're good in general, and like what we're going to do with like coal and stuff. Watching earlier this year, maybe a couple months ago, I was watching Joe Manchin and I think Ed Barrasso have a committee hearing with members of FERC. And I think two of them, one of them was ambivalent, another one was like pretty owed RTOh, and then another one was basically like, if we did the Clean Energy Performance Program in West Virginia, it would be apocalyptic for West Virginia. And then one guy said that the Clean Energy Performance Program would be like dropping an H-bomb in our current electricity markets, which I thought was astounding to hear someone say. But you can still, especially with FERC alumni from the last couple decades, when you compare what they're saying to what NERC is saying, and NERC was formed after the 65 Eastern Interconnection blackout, and it's meant, it really values reliability more than many other things. There are two totally different timbres about the problems we're facing in our energy sector.
Oh, yes.
You know, they're very concerned with what's happening.
Yes, but you know, one of the things that happened after I wrote the book was that people would write to me and say, hey, you forgot about NERC. You forgot about putting NERC in. And I said, well, the trouble is that NERC absolutely tries to review reliability. And it'll even say, you're not being reliable here. You don't have enough reserve. Mm-hmm. You don't have a high enough margin reserve. And you know what happens after that in an RTOh? Absolutely nothing. And the trouble is that if I wrote that in the book, then I would have to do a research project called NERC Suggestions and Which RTOs Ignore Them.
Well, that's also because NERC is, I think, NERC is in a governmental body the way that FERC is, right? Like NERC makes suggestions, but it can't crack the whip the way FERC can.
Yeah, that's true. They can't. But I think that I am not going to go there because I think NERC is actually a part of FERC in some aspects. And as I say, when I began looking at NERC, it seemed to me that everything I would hear about NERC was some kind of Monday morning quarterbacking. We're like, yeah, that happened, and we told you. Didn't you notice?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you brought up responses to the book, because my next question was going to be like, what have the responses been like, and what have you learned since publishing?
Well, the responses have been very, very positive. People have really liked the book. People who work in balancing authorities and stuff have written me to thank me for writing the book, because nobody knows what's going on. And, and I mean, these are all on like Twitter or email. I mean,
Sure.
if you work at a balancing authority, you don't write, "Hey, I'm really delighted that I finally read Meredith's book in public,"
Yeah, you're not
And
placing pieces in the New York Times
no,
praising the book.
that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. So, but at any rate, I was really pleased to see how many people really liked the book. And also I was really pleased at how many people wanted to get in touch with me, wanted me to speak to their class, to speak to their group. I've spoken to an amazing number of groups, including the Sierra Club, one group in the Sierra Club in Maine. And I mean, it's been, to me, to be asked to speak to the Sierra Club, since I'm a well-known nuclear supporter, and is amazing. But the thing about the book is Shorting the Grid book, is I really try to be, in my own little way, not like FERC, but fuel neutral. I was just trying to explain how the grid works, how different types of power plants interact with the grid, and so forth. And it's something people just don't know much about.
Right.
And so I was really pleased at the number of groups that have asked me to speak, and the reviews on Amazon, and it's been very nice. On the other hand, I think that it's also making me some enemies. But I mean, I don't worry about that too much, because
Sure.
I'm a retired person. I mean, what are they going to do? Fire me? So I'm a grandmother. I live out here with my husband. I write books. But there's this whole bunches of people who really don't want anything to do with me, and not that I'm wanting anything to do with them, but in many cases, I acknowledge that they know something about the grid. They just have such a strong agenda about the kind of power plants that should be on it, which are renewables, that they can't see anything else as a valid discussion of it.
Yeah.
I mean, the endless discussion of the grid is how to get it to 100% renewables.
Yep.
That's the endless discussion. And if you say, well, let's discuss reliability. I mean, one group in Maine, not-for-profit NGO group, actually was making statements, not about my book, but to ISO New England, saying, you're all about reliability, but we're not. We want a clean grid, whether it's reliable or not. I'm like, are you guys out of your pea-picking minds?
Especially in Maine. Like, Maine is not renowned for its temperate climate.
I know. If you said that in California, where, to be honest, when I was living in Northern California, all you needed is a fireplace on a cold night. I mean, it didn't freeze, but once every 3 years. And you could say, well, we don't need reliability. We just need clean. But people in Maine saying that is completely bizarre.
Yeah, that's very surprising. What was the response from the chapter of the Sierra Club you talked to? That sounds like a very fascinating place to go give your spiel.
Well, actually, it was pretty positive, because the thing is that when I'm talking about the grid, and I'm talking about the different auctions and how they go and the clearing price and all this, this is all new information to most people, totally new information. I mean, like, if I were to go there and say, nuclear doesn't put out any, nuclear has a beautiful profile in terms of low greenhouse gas emissions. That wouldn't be new information. They might reject the information, but it wouldn't be the first time they'd ever heard it.
Right.
But when I'm talking about the grid, for many people, it's the first time they've ever heard it. They're like, oh, wait a minute. You're saying that a power plant could bid in at 0 cents per kilowatt hour. And then if the clearing price is 40 cents per kilowatt hour, they get the clearing price instead of what they bid in. And I say, yeah, that's it. If the highest priced power plant on the grid bid in at 40 cents per kilowatt hour, every plant that's on the grid at that time gets the 40 cents. And they go like, well, why? So what I'm trying to say is there's not an answer to that one, by the way. But but the thing is that it's all new. And so to some extent, because people know so little about the grid, I've been a little bit protected from attacks on what I said, because people are trying so hard to follow it because it's all new.
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense. They're sort of, as I was when I read the book, like bowled over by the complexity of how this is run. I mean, we so take for granted the grid, but I live in California now and I can't really take it for granted anymore because
Yes.
it's become so fragile. Like that's, I mean, there are people in California who will likely experience energy poverty at bad times. Not that it's ever a good time to experience energy poverty, probably within the next 5 to 10 years if things keep going the way that they're going, especially if Diablo Canyon closes, which I hope it doesn't. And am, of course, fighting for it to stay open. But that sort of brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is you and I, the first time we talked about this, it was basically right after the Texas blackouts. And that
Oh,
had changed a lot of the energy conversation about the grid almost overnight. I mean, my father lives in Alpine, so I was very worried about what was happening there. You know, when I went out to visit him a few months later in June, people were still talking about the blackouts. You
oh,
know,
it's a very frightening event.
yeah, and a lot of people died. And right now, we are on the precipice of potentially another energy crisis. And I was wondering what you're paying attention to now and what you're seeing.
Well, I'm paying attention to some extent to the discussions around coal and natural gas. I mean, I'm
Mm,
always paying attention to nuclear, but the thing is that the United States has immense quantities of coal,
hmm
and yet we're having coal shortages because we haven't been digging it up, leave it in the ground and all that.
hmm
And I'm also concerned with whether the fracking revolution is going to hit a hard stop just when we need it to get bigger. And I don't really. One of the things about my book is I try very hard to talk about the grid as it is, the grid that's there,
hmm
and I try not to project into the future too much. But I don't think it's too much of a projection into the future to say that things could get very difficult in the United States also with coal and natural gas issues.
hmm
We only have the pipelines we have.
It's hard to build more if we're building anymore
Not to,
because of environmental concerns.
yeah, yeah. And we may find more natural gas, but the fracking, the wells for fracking have a very short life expectancy. You have to keep drilling. They're not like the famous wells of the Texas oil fields, which were just like gushers or something.
Yeah,
They
gargantuan. I
yeah,
mean, I think that's the whole premise of Beverly Hillbillies, right? Is that the father accidentally shoots the ground and oil spews up everywhere. That's how they get
yes,
rich and
yes,
move to
yes.
Beverly Hills.
Yeah, that is well, it was almost like that. I mean, people had no idea what they were going to encounter until their whole rig flew up into the air. And, oh gosh, there's a lot of oil down there. Now,
hmm
now we're a lot better at knowing how much there is and controlling flow and all that. But you understand that with fracking, you go into a formation of shale that doesn't have a lot of holes in it. It's not as porous as the sandstones and so forth that you have in other parts of the oil world. And so it doesn't have as much natural gas per cubic foot. And so the well has a tendency to run out earlier.
hmm
and you have to keep drilling new wells, refracking wells. It's if you went to a traditional area of oil and gas production, and they were fracking and they were shooting steam down the well and so forth, they say, well, we're on the secondary level now. We got all the oil that could come out sort of naturally due to the pressure underground, and now we're pushing it out with steam, we're pushing it out with CO2, we're pushing it out with water or fracking, opening more passageways for it. And so it's all like it's secondary, and fracking is like, oh, you can do secondary more places. And I don't know. I feel like I'm getting a little beyond myself here, but I just want to say that I worry about the longevity of the fracking areas.
Yeah. Yeah, I read a recent piece in Financial Times about perhaps things in North Dakota slowly petering out in terms of what we can expect from fracking wells, et cetera. I mean, I think there's still some hopes in like the Permian Basin, which overlaps both Texas and New Mexico, but we'll see. I mean, this is sort of the problem, right? Where we're having fanciful conversations about energy publicly, but we aren't having conversations that are interested in grid fundamentals and how we keep developed industrial society running. You know, this is something that the rhetoric of climate crisis has done for RTOs in the renewable industry, is that it has given them a get out of jail free card, where no one really has any questions about the downstream effects of what they're doing or how they're implemented or what their usefulness is. And so now we find ourselves worried about whether we have enough coal on the grid, which isn't a place. I mean, I'm thankful for every piece of fossil fuel that's ever been burnt, because that's how we got to where we are now. And there's much to be grateful for. But having a conversation about whether we have enough coal isn't a place I want to be.
No, I agree with you. And the other thing about being grateful for fossil fuels is that I remember I was visiting North Carolina, and we were doing a lot of hiking, and we were hiking around many beautiful areas, and a lot of waterfalls. So, if you're in the right area, I guess it's the fall line or something where things are actually the areas between the highlands and the coastal plain, and there's a lot of waterfalls. It's very beautiful, and it occurred to me to be very grateful for burning coal, because otherwise all those waterfalls will be hydro dams. You see, and instead they're very beautiful, and I can hike around them. And maybe that's selfish. Maybe selfish people want to hike in beautiful areas, while other people want to save the planet by not burning coal. I just feel like it's got to be a planet that has some wild areas, eco-modernism and all that. And of course, I much prefer to see nuclear. Don't get me wrong.
Of course. I mean, obviously. Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's true. I think, to me, I'll just say this now, and I guess I'll wrap it up by saying this, is that reading your book for me was a life-changing experience.
Wow.
Because it gave me insight into how basic energy systems work in America, and created a whole vein of historical investigation about energy policy and the structure of the grid and industrial development that now takes up a large portion of my time, and has required me scavenging sometimes very out of print books to do so, but also because it gave me a sense of gratitude for what we've achieved as a society, and why taking care of something like the grid is an important act of stewardship for succeeding generations. And that is not something I felt quite as powerfully or understood as deeply until I read your work.
Yes, I think people tend to think that we can manipulate the grid all kinds of ways and it's still going to be just fine because it's always been just fine. But actually, it isn't that hard to get yourself into a situation where there's rolling blackouts. And it's not that hard to get into a situation where most upper middle class people want to have a generator at their house. And this is not, in other words, they can afford it. That's what
of course.
Maybe everybody would want one, but they're not inexpensive objects in general, and they're not all that expensive either, I guess. But I really wanted people to look at this, and it was a hard book to write. I called it the book that ate Meredith because I just kept coming up with more and more things that I had to put in there, and as you can tell, I also made a lot of decisions not to put in NERC, not to put in the independent market monitors, and so forth, because every one would have been a major research project to show that it wasn't doing any good. And so what you do is you follow the things that are affecting things. And if someone asks you, why didn't you put in that? You can always say, well, because they don't have much effect. Or you could say, wait till my next book, which I don't know. Well, but actually, I'm not sure I'm going to write a next book about it. I mean, I am a grandmother and I do write, but I mean, I'm just sort of like, this was an amazing amount of effort to write this book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stunning.
Absolutely. I don't think I told you this. I've told you this, but my wife would sometimes read it over my shoulder, and it would make her so mad that she couldn't sleep. And she started calling it the hell book. She was like, are you still reading that hell book? Because she was like, why don't people just take care of things? So on that note, I would like to say, where can people find you if they want to find your book or find you?
Okay, you can find my book on Amazon, and Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid. And you can find me all over the place if you know my name, which is Meredith Angwin, Meredith Angwin, Angwin. It's a Cornish name. It's my husband's name, of course, but it's kind of an unusual name, but it's Cornish. He comes from a mining family, as a matter of fact. At any rate, and you can find me at Meredith Angwin on Twitter. You can write me at Meredith Angwin, all one word, at Gmail. You can find my website at meredithangwin.com. Let me see other ways you can find me. I mean, I'm also as Meredith Angwin on LinkedIn and Facebook, but on Facebook's a little touchy because what you want to do is go to Meredith Angwin author on Facebook. Right. Otherwise, you'll see a lot of pictures of my grandkids, which is perfectly lovely. They're lovely grandkids. But, assuming that you want to learn about the grid, you go to Meredith Angwin author.
That's right. Okay. Well, Meredith, thank you so much for joining me. This was a wonderful time. And listeners, as ever, stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant. Till next time.
Thank you.